Welcome, everyone. I'm Marilee Robson. I have had stories published in Ellery Queen magazine, Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, The People's Friend in the UK, and various other magazines and anthologies. And I'm the author of a traditional mystery called Murder is Uncooperative that takes place in a Vancouver housing co-op. And I'm very delighted to have four of my colleagues here to talk about short stories. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So I'd like to start with Alice Fitzpatrick. Alice, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your writing?
I've been writing short stories for as long as I can remember, and I published literary short stories through the 90s. It wasn't until I switched to, so I started writing crime novels that I switched to crime short stories. My latest story is The Client, and it's being published in the Crime Writers of Canada's Cold Canadian Crime. I normally write from the point of view of women, but this story is told from the point of view of a young man. And I've always wanted to explore the idea of the unreliable narrator. And in this, I realized by the time I finished writing the story, this is in fact what happened. So that it's an interesting departure for me.
Thank you. Next, we have Rosemary McCracken. Rosemary? Oh, I think you're muted.
Hi there. Is that
Hi.
better? Okay,
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, okay. I've been a journalist for many years. I earned my living through writing articles. I was a newspaper journalist for decades. And when I first started writing fiction, I actually started writing short stories, literary short stories. I thought this was the way to go because they were short. And then I morphed into writing novels. I wanted to write longer pieces, and I was writing crime novels. And at that point, there wasn't didn't seem to be much of a market for short stories. So I didn't write them. I kept on writing the novels. And then about 10 years ago, maybe less, their anthologies were coming out with the various crime conferences like VoucherCon and the Mesdames of Mayhem, of which Madeline here and Jane and I are part of a networking group. We started putting out our own novels, and we're working on the 5th right now. Not novels, sorry, short story collections. More and more opportunities. And it's great.
Great. Thanks, Rosemary. Madeline Harris-Callaway.
Hi, thanks, Marilee. It's good to see you. Next time, I hope we meet in the real world.
So
This is pretty good. This is pretty good. I see we have 68 people watching, which is awesome. And I hope you're all from across Canada and welcome. This is it's so exciting to be part of something national now. About myself, I have one traditionally published novel, which came out a few years ago. But I got my start in crime writing short stories, and I've just continued to do that. My works appeared in several anthologies and e-zines, been up for various awards and stuff, and come out in publications like Mystery Weekly. And I am a co-founder of the Mesdames of Mayhem. We are almost 10 years old now. It's really exciting to think we were founded in 2013. We have 4 anthologies out. Our theme is 13 because originally we were 13 authors, so why not go with that? And 13's definitely been our lucky number. Our 5th anthology will be coming out this fall, a bit of a cross genre. It called In the Spirit of 13, so a bit of supernatural and also a bit of alcohol. So a fun one for difficult times.
thank you. And finally, we have Jane Burfield. Jane?
Hi, I've been writing short stories since, well, I was published first in 2001 when I wrote a short story to try and get 2 friends to write short stories to enter the Boney Peak contest. I didn't like short stories. I liked a good meaty read. And I said, even I will enter if I can get you 2 to enter, expecting one or both of them to win. I ended up winning. And I then decided I'd better sort of look at them more carefully. In about, I think it was 2010 or 2009, Val McDermott was over just during the SARS scare. And she came up to me, one of my stories had appeared in the program book. And she said, you know, Jane, we've got to save the short story. You know, this is really important. It's an unsung hero of writing. So I got interested in that. Thanks to the Mesdames of Mayhem, which, you know, I'm so grateful for. We've had a chance to explore a lot of different writers and also to encourage new writers. That's what I really love doing, is trying to encourage people that say, I want to write, into people that say, I'm published. So that was important for me. I now appreciate short stories. And I'm now learning the structure and manipulating voice and perspective and everything. Anyway,
Thank you.
and I loved your story, by the way, in Grave Diagnosis. I read that yesterday.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Yes, yeah. Several of us are in that anthology. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have a couple of prepared questions. Just a reminder to the audience that if you have questions for your panel, please post them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, which will make it easier for us to find them. But just to start up the discussion, I want to say, well, just Linda Landrigan, who's the editor-in-chief of Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, said, authors need to ensure that the story they want to tell is properly sized for whatever format they choose. And I know most of you write novels as well as short stories, but I was just wondering if you could tell us, what's your favorite length to write, and what length of story do you find the hardest? And you know, some people have said it's harder to write a short story than the novel. So I'd like to hear what you think. Rosemary, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, my stories seem to come in at about 3,500 words. I have a template in my mind for stories of 3,500 words. I find the longer ones very difficult because they seem to want to turn into a novel or a novella, and those are totally different forms. So I like to keep them economical and efficiency of writing, and anywhere from 3,000 to 3,500 words is where I seem to be putting them out at.
Oh, thank you. And I think that's kind of a popular length for magazines to sell. So great. Madeline, what about you?
Well, I'm the opposite of Rosemary, actually. I tend to write long, and I guess that my stories tend to fall between 8,000 and 12,000 words. I think I get carried away with atmosphere and characters, and create world building in a way. As Caro Soul says often, you know, the problem with short fiction is that you create a world and then you have to leave it, which is, if you write a novel, you know, you can perhaps turn that into a series. I mean, you can always turn it into a series of short stories as well. Personally, I find writing really short extremely challenging. I totally admire people like Rosemary and Melody Campbell, who can write like really short, in an economy of words, can write, create another world and another complete story. So I begin to think it's just the way your imagination and mind works. And I don't know, it's still a challenge for me.
Yeah, it's difficult. Jane, how about you? Do you have a preferred length?
I like Madeline, I write long, and then I have to take a cutlass to it, and it's a bloody business. I'm scared to write a novel, so I sort of go too much into the short story. Carol Soules, the same wonderful Carol Soules, said my problem is that I sort of condense a novel down into a short story. And it's true. So I try and come in about 5,000 words. I've come in by cutting the last few words exactly on 5,000, when that's the max that I'm allowed.
Great, okay. And Alice, you write novels as well as short stories. Do you have a preference?
I do. It depends on what I'm writing about. I mean, I find the story will take as long as it takes. My short stories are around 3,000 to 5,000 words. But having said that, about 25 years ago, I wrote a 44-page short story. And obviously couldn't publish it anywhere because it was too long, but I just put it aside, but I couldn't let it go. And it turned out to be the basis of the first book of my Meredith Island mysteries. So I guess the thing is, don't throw anything out.
Yes.
Always recycle. But yeah, I mean, I basically tell the story, and sometimes it becomes a novel, sometimes it becomes a short story. It finds its own length.
Yeah, so that seems to agree with what Linda said about the story just finds its own length. I always admire people who can write flash fiction and get a story out in a couple hundred words, but that always seems like a challenge. I'm going to work on that. So, okay, similar question. Edgar Allan Poe wrote about the stories that should be read in one sitting for the immensely important effect derivable from unity of impression. And I've sometimes described a short story as an amuse-bouche rather than a complete meal. It's perfect in itself, but it doesn't have all of the substance and courses that a full meal does. So my question is, why is a short story not just a little novel? What makes a short story different? And what are the elements of a successful short story? Madeline, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think Edgar Allan Poe's quote captures it perfectly, and he was the great master. But I think it's the crystallization of an idea, and a singular idea, that you can get across in an economy of words. And I think another thing that is really a hallmark of an excellent short story is a twist. But it's a twist that's not just a surprise, but of great revelation. And in an ideal world, it would be a revelation that gives us an insight into human nature that we may not have had before, or an insight into life and humanity as we know it. And whether we write that in a crime story or literary story, to me, it's immaterial. But that's, as crime writers, that's what we strive for in a crime writing story. What we're writing about crime, but also as an expression of an insight into human nature.
Interesting. And Jane, you mentioned that you're always trying to write novels and a short story. So how does that work for you?
I don't try, it seems to happen. And then I have to slash off the beginning, I have to slash to the middle, and I have to slash off the end. You want to take, and my lovely critique group is very patient with me and is teaching me this. You have to take the essential kernel in the center, the thing where the protagonist undergoes change, where there's the turning moment of whatever their story is at that point in life. I think that's really important. I agree with Madeline about the Edgar Allan Poe quote that it's should be read in one session. Actually, they're little jewels. They're amazing to create a world in one little thing, and to find the twist at the end is delightful. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's an important point. I think that you do have to, that it has to take place in one setting. Put the character in the middle of the action, I guess. Rosemary, what do you think about this?
Well, I'm a very character-driven writer, so I see the short story as one facet of your protagonist, generally your protagonist's life, or a main character's life. And in my most recent story was published in the Crime Writers of Canada's and recent anthology, Cold Canadian Crime, titled In From the Cold. And in that story, my young protagonist looks up a part of her family, looks up her aunt, that she's been estranged, and part of the family she's been estranged from. So I keep it, that's the focus. So it's the focus on this one thing in her life. She's a graduate student, I say that in passing, comes to Toronto, but we don't know anything about her studies, what her career she's pursuing. That's not what the story is about. It's this family she's discovering, meeting up with her aunt. So it's that focus of the trying to keep that focus in mind, and cutting out all the, whereas a novel you can have subplots to do with her romance and et cetera, but you just don't get into that. There's an efficiency of that you have to let the reader fill in some of the blanks. You know, I've made some allusions to her father's remarried, but I don't pursue that. Let the reader fill in the blanks for, she probably wouldn't get along with her new stepmother, but I don't get into that. So it's keep in mind that it's short fiction. I guess that's key. And the twist is lovely at the end if you can, but some stories it's hard to come up with a twist. And if the twist has to feel inevitable. So there should be some little clues along the way. If it's just out of nowhere, it will fall flat. And now we all want twists, but just keep in mind that the twist has to seem inevitable in that story.
That's great advice. And Alice, you had a novel or a story in that same anthology. Is there a difference in your process for how you approach a novel and approach a short story?
Well, I'm going to put my English teacher hat on at this point, and I know this definition does not fit every short story, but for me, a short story is, as Jane said, it's like a little jewel. It's one moment, one significant moment in time in someone's life, and you're kind of shining a spotlight on that. So it tends to be very limited, focused. Limited can have a bad connotation. Limited number of characters, limited setting. Often it takes place in real time. One major conflict, maybe one point of view, and there's no subplots, as has been mentioned. Often there is no character development, although I know in a lot of literary stuff there's character development. So it's, whereas a novel can be a great expanse, even if it takes place over a week, and often if you're solving a mystery or a police procedural, it does take place over a week. But this is this wonderful little, as Jane said, it's this wonderful little jewel where you kind of focus on one really important point in someone's life, even if they don't realize it's important.
Thank you. And I guess we want to talk a little bit about the process for all of you and what comes first for you in writing a short story. Is it character? Is it the plot? Is it the setting? And Jane, you mentioned that you were more interested in character when you start your stories. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Very much. I love my shower in the morning because that's where I get my ideas. There's something about the little negative ions zipping around that do that. I find that if I come up with a vague idea of a really bizarre form of getting rid of somebody, where it's the perfect way out of a problem, the character might be a little bit vulnerable for some reason or another. And so I start with that. I then go for a title. What I want to do is to have my title be a bit of a pun, a way of creating resonance through the story, where, you know, somebody thinks it means one thing, but it's revealed at the end that it could mean many other things. And then really plotting, I find, like the story itself, the trouble is I go off in all directions. So the characters to me are the arrow, are the spine, are the important thing. And I love them when they're devious.
That's interesting. Okay, and Rosemary, you mentioned earlier that you start
Yeah,
with characters.
Character is really important, and in From the Cold, Helen is my protagonist, the young woman. But I got the idea. I have to I actually, to start the story, I have to have this idea of a character. So it was the aunt's character, the aunt that she looks up. And she comes to Toronto and she makes it her business, the young woman, to look up this aunt of hers. And I had the character of the aunt all mapped out in my mind, and then I could come up with the niece. But to me, before I start writing, I have to have a character that inspires me. My current novel, that my 5th Pat Tierney novel that I've started, I couldn't start. I started it a couple of months ago. I had to get a character, a pivotal character, not my Pat Tierney protagonist, but another character in my mind. So character is very, very important for me. And from there, the plot can come. How would this character react? So I guess I am a pantster in that way, that I don't, the plot is very important, but it comes from the character, and the two are they go hand in hand. Absolutely. You just can't create a plot unless you know how that character is going to react to the situation in which she finds herself.
Thank you. And Alice, what about you? Where do you start?
When I'm writing novels, I start with a what if situation, and I already have my characters because they're usually the people who live on the island. But that doesn't seem to work for me with short stories. The client, which is my latest one, I took a MOOC course in creative writing. That's the massive open online courses. And I've been writing for 65 years, but I thought maybe I'll learn something that was free. And it was a story prompt. And I think it was a writing prompt, and I think it was a picture. And I did a character study of this young, slightly disheveled young man. And it turned out to be my protagonist in The Client. So for that one, I started with the character. The story I published previously in Sisters in Crime, Whole Shebang 3, Summer of the Black Madonna, I was sitting in the English department and people were discussing their favorite restaurants in the European cities that they had visited. I didn't have a lot to contribute to that conversation. So I listened intently, and one of the teachers said, it was the summer my father rented the villa in Tuscany, and immediately my writer's brain just, what a great opening line. And I just sort of grabbed it, and I spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out how to finish it. And I finished it with, it was the summer my father rented the villa in Tuscany that I killed my mother's lover.
Yeah.
Because I'm a crime writer. And at that point, I had the plot, I had the character, I knew it had to be written from first person. And so the whole thing kind of fell into place. And it was just, you grab it anywhere you can. But Rosemary's right, it's character. Once I had a young woman who was about to kill her mother's lover, then I thought, what a good character. So yes.
Thanks. And Madeline?
Yeah, I'm absolutely building on what everybody else has said. Character is extremely important, but I think inspiration for a story can come from almost anything. And with me, it often happens as an idea. So the most recent, but actually my most recent story, my story that's coming out in November in a British anthology called Gone, Gone, is a story, Must Love Dogs. It was actually based upon a dog. And it happened to be my friend's dog. And my friend's dog would eat anything. And the dog ate her car key. And my friend did not realize this until she got in the car car with her dog, and the car started. And I thought, this is just such she realized the dog had eaten the key. So I said, well, what did you do? She said, well, car keys are really expensive, And it's like I'm gonna be out $300. So she waited for nature to take its course.
Really?
But I thought this would be such a wonderful premise for a Black comedy story. And I was just longing to use this in a story, and eventually one came to me. And another one was that my husband and I went traveling. We went out to the West Coast, actually, and we were in Vancouver walking down Davie Street. And there was the bakery the Maple Leaf Bakery that I had frequented when I was a graduate student many years before and living in the West End of Vancouver. And I thought, that's amazing. Like, what survives? Everything else around the neighborhood changes. And then, but the bakery survived. And then I got my idea for a cross-genre speculative fiction story. Why not make the bakeries the node in the space-time continuum? And then my protagonist travels through the various bakeries to get to various dimensions in time and space. You have to read the story in A Great Diagnosis. It's called The Eternal Bakery of the Fractal Mind. So, but and then one of my absolute favorite stories was this, a friend of mine had a job driving cars from Canada to the United States. And a lot of people of a certain age and a certain demographic take on this job because they're retired. And I thought, well, if a guy could do it, why couldn't a woman do it? Well, I mean, it's something I could do, like I'm a driver. And that's eventually how I developed my character for The Seeker, which appeared in The Dame Was Troubled, which came out with Coffin Hop Press a few years ago, a noir written by Canadian women starring only Canadian women protagonists. Then I made, of course, my character a lot tougher and a lot more knowledgeable about cars than myself. But again, inspiration can come from anything, but it's built on character.
Thank you. And I guess we need to talk a little bit about what defines a crime short story. Do you think it has to include a murder, or do you write about other types of crimes? And Alice, you've written both literary and crime short fiction. So what do you think the difference is? What do you consider the elements of a crime short story?
When I first started writing crime novels, I resisted writing crime short stories because I had this idea in my head that there had to be a murder. And I didn't think I could do it, that I could have somebody murdered and then have it solved in 12 pages. When I came to write Summer of the Black Madonna, I was going to have a murder. I wrote it to see if I could do it, but then it never happened. So and I've never killed anybody in a short story. Killed lots of people in novels, but never in a short story. Spoiler alert. So I think that I don't think there has to be a murder. I think it's a crime story. So I think as long as we have something that someone somewhere will define as a crime, I think that's good enough.
Great. And Jane, what about you?
I've had so much fun killing people in short stories who really need to be killed. They really need it. And I love using unusual murder methods. So, you know, I certainly can tolerate a short story where the crime is lesser, especially if it's leading somewhere and if it's sort of the epicenter of whatever's going on in that protagonist's life. But I love a good juicy murder where you get rid of a nasty person. It's very satisfying.
It's funny. And Madeline?
I think pretty much you have to have a murder. My stories tend to have violence of some sort in them. Maybe not intentional murder, but usually a violent death of some kind. Yeah, I think so. I mean, ostensibly one could write a funny story where you would have a great caper or a great, heist where you wouldn't necessarily have to have a murder. But I think personally, I need that threat.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it has to be some kind of scary thing. And Rosemary, what do you think?
Many of my stories don't have murders. There's crime, crimes can really, there are crimes that can really, really devastate a life as much as a murder does. And I think they're important to be explored too. They can, recent one was published by Mystery Weekly, The Passenger, no murder in that. one that was based on Elvis Presley's funeral that I actually attended years ago. No
Wow.
murder in that, but a drug deal. Yeah, so there's awful crimes out there that can, or the threat, but and violence can come into that. But I'm not adverse to a juicy murder myself. So the story in the CWC anthology has a murder in there. So whatever works for your story. But murder is not always the most awful thing that can happen to people. There are terrible things that can happen to people that ruin their lives, and they have to live on with the results of those crimes.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. That's I mean, what I was thinking, I have sometimes written stories that I guess they're more of a thriller that there's you're trying to avoid some dreadful action, and I think traditionally in the end, avoiding the dreadful action is good, but sometimes it has, it happens, and then that's a different kind of story, and also a story where someone is thinking about committing a murder but doesn't. I think that's an interesting thing too. So I kind of regard the genre as fairly fluid. But Madeline, you mentioned time travel and surreal, and I know that some of your stories have moved in genre mixes. So what do you think about all of that?
About the threat. Yeah, I think it is surreal. I suppose my story that came out in Judy's anthology, Moonlight and Misadventures, kind of surreal. Again, at first there wasn't a threat per se, but it's more like the threat is the threat of urban development. And I guess the story is called The Moon God of Broadmoor, and it's based actually on a newspaper story I read as a child. And this is before cosplay was famous and accepted really in our society. But it was about this man who thought he was Superman. He was in New York City, and he ran around in costume and lived like Superman. And eventually he died, and he died in a particularly strange and surreal way, which actually happens to my hero. You have to read the story to find out what happens. But my self-styled moon god of Broadmoor thinks he's Thoth, the Egyptian god of the moon, and he is against urban development. And that's the thread of the story. And so I suppose it is a bit of a surreal story. But the murder that happens is more of an accident and kind of leads to the tragic conclusion of the story. But yeah, I do not necessarily intentionally write cross genre, but sometimes the stories come out that way. And I guess that is the curse of being a pantser rather than a plotter.
Good point. What about the rest of you? Have any of you sort of verged into different stories, different genres? Yeah, Jane?
I was writing a story for a Mesdames anthology called 13 Claws. You had to have your basis of the story. It had to not only have a crime, but you had to have animals heavily involved in it. And I thought, I don't really want to do a cat or a dog. So I wrote on dragons. So it was sort of crossover into almost YA and fantasy. And I had so much fun. I had so much fun with it, to the point where a couple of young readers have messaged me via their parents saying, when's the next one coming out?
And you should write a novel with those characters, I think.
It would be fun. I love them.
They're wonderful. I love that story.
Thank you.
Great. Any of the rest of you blurring genres at all? Or are you strictly crime?
I'm strictly crime right now, yeah.
What about you, Marilee? Do you blur genres?
I do. I did my most recent story is it's a mystery, but it's a story called Tired of Bath in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine that is a time travel caper with involving a stolen Jane Austen manuscript, and part of the story. Part of the story is the crime, but most of the story is trying to get Jane Austen back to where she belongs and not in modern day time. So that's a, yeah, that's blurring. And I'm kind of toying with something science fiction-y. It's a traditional crime story, but it's different setting. So yeah, that's what I like about short stories is the opportunity to try different things.
Yes, yes, and to play,
Yeah.
play. Yeah.
I wrote a thesis in fourth year university on the Lord of the Rings from primary sources only with my Chaucer professor. And, you know, when I go to Lord of the Rings events, rarely, I can win any trivia contest going. So I fell in love there. Maybe that's where dragons came in too.
Fabulous. So going back to crime fiction, what attracts you to crime stories? Is it a need to have a sense of justice? Are you exploring evil in the world? Have you written stories where the murderer doesn't get caught? What's your attraction to this? And I guess Rosemary, you want to start?
I guess it's, I think fundamentally for me, the bottom line is justice. You want to see justice coming back into the world, bringing back the good, making sure that the good people are safe, that the source of evil is vanquished, and all of that. And that's it for me. Except now the story that I wrote for the CWC anthology, that proves me wrong there. That justice is not restored at the end of that novel, unless there's a sequel. And the person who wreaks havoc comes to justice.
A sticky end.
Yes. If I need to write another sequel to that story.
Oh, that would be interesting. And Jane, in your story, in the grave diagnosis, the murderer, I don't want to give things away, but there's a possibility that murderer gets away with things.
Oh, I sincerely hope so. I sincerely hope so. I guess similar to Rosemary, I guess underneath it all, and joking aside, I'm deeply interested in the restoration of balance. And that involves, I don't know if rough justice is the right term for it, but there has to be justice where the human courts can't affect it. Justice where somebody, it's not really vigilante, but I suppose it is somewhat. To me, it's important to have a sense of karma being repaid, of justice. And that really drives me in my writing.
Yeah, some people just need killing.
They do. They do.
And Alice, what brought you to crime fiction, moving away from literary fiction?
I'm started off being British. I was born in England, so of course I grew up in Agatha Christie, and I really loved, and I feel really awful saying it because everybody else is being so ethical, I really loved the puzzle. I really loved the way it was put together and sort of unpacking it. And as you know, with Agatha Christie, there's often a little piece that gets dropped at the end that she didn't tell anybody, and just drives you crazy. So when I came to write them, I thought, can I make a puzzle that I can put together and other people can unpack? But also what happened along the way is that the people who were wrongly accused in my books, or the people whose relatives were killed in my books, they sort of get some sort of closure, or I guess they get the justice. So it happened, it sort of evolved into that. And having said that, the client, my short story, depending on how you view Henry, the protagonist, whether you see him as a good guy or a bad guy, there may or may not be justice at the end of that story. So that's sort of up to the reader to decide.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Who writes? Madeline, you have any comments on that?
No, the reason I started to read crime fiction was because I love the sense of justice and having the balance restored. But in my own writing, I think I take on a much more bleak vision because I tend to write noir. So again, as Jane was saying, a certain rough justice, if not vigilantism, some kind of karma, the right karma, like the right people get punished or die. But you know, in some of my stories, it doesn't quite work out like that. It's more like a more bleak vision of life, which I suppose life and experience intrudes when you're actually writing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question to explore, is what is justice? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. We'd almost have a whole session on
We
what that
should,
is.
we should have a session on that. And Madeline, I think you and Rosemary both mentioned that there seems to be more opportunities now for short stories and more anthologies around. Why do you think that is? And and what kind of markets would you recommend to new writers? Maddie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I definitely think there's been an upsurge in interest in writing short fiction. And it'd be really interesting to we could almost spend an entire session thinking about why that is. On the surface, I think that people's attention span because of social media are shorter. And I think people, perhaps readers, gravitate more to reading short fiction. I also think too that with digitization, authors are reclaiming power. Like in before, we can actually, through anthologies, have a much greater chance of getting published and getting our words out to the readership. As you know, as the larger corporations, the bigger snakes swallowing snakes, there's less and less opportunity to become traditionally published because, you know, there's a tendency towards monopoly in the publishing world. But, you know, in the short story level, short fiction level, I think authors can reclaim that. And anthologies have really taken off. I think there's now a category in the Antonys for best anthology, which is really great way for it to become recognized. And also as the rise of the themed anthologies, it makes that much more interesting and attractive for the reader. For a young author starting out, I definitely would, I think it was, you can start with the big ones, Ellery Queen magazine and Alfred Hitchcock magazine. If you get in there, you know you've really arrived. Mystery Magazine is another excellent source that's Canadian-based, a Hamilton-based publication. And I definitely advise people to join the Short Mystery Fiction Society because they offer often wonderful opportunities, publishing opportunities for new writers and anthologies both in North America and overseas.
Thank you. And Rosemary, you mentioned that was what started you writing short stories too.
Yeah, it did. I like writing both in tandem, novels and short stories. A novel takes me anywhere from 2 to 4 years to complete, and so I don't see it as building credits that a publisher might take my novel for at all. Usually when somebody is looking at a publishing company is looking at your novel, they're not considering your short story background at all. They're looking at the novel per se. But it keeps your name out there while you're writing the longer piece. And if you have every writer has reader fans, and they'll be asking you when is the next novel coming out. Well, if you've write some short stories, you can point them in that direction. I often, in perhaps half of my short stories, I use my Pat Tierney protagonist from my novels if the story suits a woman of her age. She's in her 40s, she's professional. Some stories don't suit that kind of character, but if it does, I'll put her in there. So I will at some point put out a collection of Pat Tierney short stories as well. But I like doing the two in tandem, a break for yourself, something to give you some short fiction to give your readers who are interested in following your writing while you're writing the bigger piece. And it's a nice balance.
Thank you. And Alice, what about you?
I mean, I agree with the declining attention span theory. And if you assume that a short story is about the size of a novel, a standard novel chapter, they're nice to have. A lot of people are now reading on their phones, reading on their tablets. They will, they're nice to sort of read on the way home on the subway, if one has a subway, just on your tablet or over lunch at the office. Now, having said that, we also have this new phenomenon of binging Netflix entire seasons. So I'm assuming those are the full-length novel people, as opposed to just looking at the tablet as you're eating your 45-minute lunch period. So yeah, and certainly there are more and more anthologies coming out. A lot of the Sisters in Crime organized chapters are bringing them out. Almost every conference every year is bringing out an anthology. So somebody's got to be reading them.
Yeah, seem to be selling. Yeah.
And the thing too is a lot of the standard mystery magazines are now online. So you don't have to wait for your mailman or mail person to deliver your copy or go and buy it somewhere. So they're a lot more available, I think, than they used to be.
And Jane, any comments?
Similar, I think there is a shorter attention span. I go back to Sesame Street. I think a lot of people, when that was on, were trained in a sort of a short attention span. So I call it the Sesame Street phenomenon. I think COVID has made it difficult for some people to read. I have a dear friend who taught English, was head of English for many years, and he has problems reading now because of COVID. Just a change. I'm hoping to see a continuing upthrust. I was looking up some statistics, and reading has increased in a major way during COVID, and sort of younger people, and the libraries have adapted by having ebooks available and audiobooks, etc. Not so much for short story anthologies. I'm going to have to investigate that. But I now like them. I hated them in 2000, but 2001 I started to change my mind.
Great. Well, I guess we should move to the questions from the audience in a minute, but just I have one final question before I do that is, a couple of you have mentioned themed anthologies. Do they motivate you to do something different, give you bright ideas, or do you prefer to work from your own inspiration? Alice, do you want to start?
I wish I could write to order. I really do, but I can't. The other problem I have is I would like to learn how to do that. I think that would be very good for my self-discipline. The other problem I have is by the time I learn about the anthology and what the theme is, I maybe have a month to produce a story, and it takes me sometimes years to write a story because the little jewel metaphor, I go over I polish every single word, every single sentence, because it is so compact. I don't do it in books. Maybe I figure I can get away with stuff in books. I can't in novels. I can't in short stories, but it takes me a long time. So I would love to be able to do that. I did. There was I think it was a fantasy anthology, and they gave everybody a picture of a staircase out in the middle of the woods going nowhere. And it was, so I had, I created, I created the outline for the story. By the time I came around to writing it, the deadline had passed. So I really admire people who can write fast and who can write to theme. So, but not me.
I love writing to order. I spent many years as a newspaper reporter, and every day you come in, there'd be have a new assignment on your desk, and you'd have to tackle it. So when I heard that Cold Canadian Crime was coming up, I was really looking forward to hearing what the parameters were, what they wanted, and I can do that quite well, just my training.
Madeline?
I think it can work either way. I mean, sometimes you have a story that's sort of simmering in the back of your mind, and then a themed anthology comes out, and you think, oh yeah, I could write my story for that. And so The Dame Was Trouble. That actually started out as a novel. I was working on a novel, and then I thought, well, I had only written about 3 or 4 chapters, and I thought, well, I can take that character and put her into a short story. And again, as we were talking about, just making it about a single instance in time, and I could create a story that way. And that wouldn't have happened if the call for that anthology hadn't happened. So, it can work both ways. But I share Alice's feelings too about finding it very difficult to write to order if I don't have a story germinating already.
And Jane, what do you think?
Actually, I love what Alice said, that it takes her a long time to write it, because sometimes it does. I just completed a short story that I was sawing away at, and it was going nowhere. And I managed to get it done just within deadline. I kind of like the challenge of writing and finding a quirky way of looking at the sort of the suggested theme. I think that's a lot of fun, and I find that very creative, and I really enjoy it. Writing is so terribly painful that you have to have some joy in it somewhere. Like it really is. so that's where I am.
Well, yeah, I kind of tend to like the chance of exploring new ideas that anthologies give you. But yeah, I share your frustration about there's sometimes that I don't make the deadline. A lot of times.
I hope you're going to write about that staircase, by the way. I can't remember who said that.
Sounds like a really neat idea.
Was that Alice? Yeah.
That was
yeah.
me. I may still write that story.
I think it's
Hope you do.
brilliant.
I hope you do.
I have
It
a
sounds
story
interesting.
about a staircase that I could write that could go into an anthology featuring staircases.
Oh.
We could publish an anthology.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Okay, we do have a couple of questions from the audience.
There's Eric. Okay.
Oh, good. Okay, then Eric can take it over. I was just saying there were some questions from the audience. So do you want to?
Eric, we can't hear you.
You're muted, Eric.
How about that?
Yeah,
That's better.
It's gonna happen eventually.
So I was just starting to look at the questions from the audience. So I'll
Yeah,
turn it over.
you have a few of them. Some of them you sort of answered while you were talking, but I thought maybe we'd still dig a little deeper. So Wendy Tippin asked, have you ever mentored a young writer from beginning to being a published author? Or even have you mentored a writer?
I was teaching novel writing at George Brown until the pandemic, at George Brown College here in Toronto until the pandemic. And one of my students, a very promising young man, he's still writing a novel, but one of his stories, and he ran it through by me, and it appeared in A Grave Diagnosis. And he had another wonderful story that I think we went back and forth on it a few times, and I told him to send it out, and I gave him some suggestions where he could send it. I'm not sure how it's fared, but I think it's got great possibilities. So yes, I do like doing that a lot, and it's great when they actually graduate from writing the novel in process to actually writing something that it actually appears in print. And that's great. You kind of feel like you're a godmother.
Yes.
Yes. I actually had an experience up north where we went to cottage at Geneva Park, which is extreme conditions of cottaging. I would teach a creative writing course up there. And one time I got one young woman, one young teen to get writing. And the interesting thing is that it let her express feelings about being second best in her family. And it was a major discovery for everybody. So I hope it was helpful and instrumental in doing that. I think I used to teach business writing, which is terribly boring. So this was much more fun.
And I think Jane's alluded to the fact that the Mesdames of Mayhem, for a few of our anthologies, we actually encouraged previously unpublished writers to submit a story. And one of our members now, we actually do let some men into the Mesdames of Mayhem. I think we have 3 this year's. One that year, and that gentleman's name is Blair Keach, and Blair has gone on from strength to strength and published several short stories already. So
I believe
I'm happy
one
to
is
say
in the CWC anthology.
that's absolutely
Yeah.
right, Rosemary.
So
He is one
went
of the contributors,
He
definitely.
went from a neophyte, what was it, 4 years ago, 5 years ago? Now he
Yeah,
has
it'd be about
several
right, yeah.
publishing credits.
Yeah. But we can't claim total responsibility because he was going to the Humber College and working really hard on his own. And so he was doing both.
Alice, even Mary Lee, if you.
Well, I'll say, yeah, I've done short story workshops, and certainly through Sisters in Crime, before we did our last anthology, we did a workshop for people, and I think several of the people in that anthology were new writers. And you know, I guess I'd also mention, I think Madeline mentioned the Short Mystery Fiction Society, which is free to join. It's an online discussion group, and they have resources, information about writing short stories and about marketing. So I would advise people to join that, and other organizations like Crime Writers of Canada and Sisters in Crime are tremendously helpful for new writers.
Thank you. Alice, any input?
I used to teach a course that in order for people to get the material out in sort of in raw form before they edited it. And at that, I also had somebody come to me and said, could you edit, she'd written a science fiction story. Could you edit the science fiction story for me? So I looked at it and made a number of suggestions to change it. And as soon as I handed it back to her, she goes, oh, never mind, it's just being published.
Oh dear.
Oh dear.
Again, you've touched on this before, but the sense of justice. So Ed J. Linkwith asked, I've read a number of crime short story anthologies recently, and I actually felt kind of depressed by several of them. A lot of the stories were more along the lines of a murderer getting away with it in some way. So there's not always justice in the short story. Now, I know you've already talked about this, but I want to say, do you feel more freedom if you wanted to experiment with a short story in that way? Because I don't think you, as a novelist, you can ever do that. But does a short story give you a little bit more freedom to experiment a bit?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Just the timeline. And you can have a lot of fun with the characters. And yeah, and sometimes successful murder where it's gotten away with is much more the justice than the murderer not sort of being caught, because the murderer was getting away with something that sort of made the world a better place.
Any other thoughts?
I would say hopefully a successful anthology has a range of different stories, so you shouldn't
Yes.
get feel completely let down after that. You know, I like to see an anthology that has a couple of humorous stories and something that's verging on romance, and you know, something that's justice served and sometimes justice denied. So different types of stories, I think, is and that's the delightful thing about short stories, is that you can explore all sorts of topics and options.
Yeah, definitely.
Because the
Uh,
short story is a little window into, often a little window into a character's life. You could, it doesn't have to be, he or she may have gotten away with the murder when that story ends, but that may not be. You're just, the camera is focusing on just a little
Mhm.
facet of his or her life. So it might not be, whereas the novel, it's almost, there's a sense of closure, that denouement. And even though another novel in the series may pick up the bad guy comes back into the scene, and that, but generally it's that generally the resolution has taken place at the end of the novel, but the short stories of camera is just focusing on the small window of that character's life.
I'm sorry, probably shouldn't have asked you that question because we're going a little long.
Oh,
So even though we're a minute over, and I have to be really strict, very quickly, Mary Lee, we've mentioned a few anthologies where your stories are. You can just say them in full, so if anybody's still watching, they can Google them.
oh, gosh, I don't know. I've written a
Oh,
number.
so you know the stuff.
One I've published in is Crime Wave, which was published 2 years ago with women writers from Western Canada, and we have a new anthology coming out, which is Women of a Certain Age, and that is available for pre-order for ebooks on a special price of $3.99.
Oh.
So.
And a few of you mentioned there's Cold Canadian Crime. So Sisters in Crime puts them out, Madame's puts them out, and Crime Writers of Canada puts them out. So I think if you look on their website, you'll be able to find those, right?
Right, yeah, and Carrot Publishing has done a couple of anthologies.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And we mentioned A Grave Diagnosis and as one. And of course, the Madame of Mayhem were also published by Garrett Publishing. So we have the 413, 13 o'clock, 13 Claws, and In the Key of 13, and coming up In the Spirit of 13.
Excellent. So thank you very much for everyone joining us today. It was a very fun talk, and I'm sure we could have gone on for an hour. So all great writers. There's many comments saying that people could listen to you all day. So thank you very much. It was a lot of